Vivek Chudamani, presented by Svayam Prakash Sharma, Part 8. Part 8 consists of verses 192 to verses 223, in which the disciple asks questions that voice his doubts and the Guru's answers to those questions. Vivek Chudamani. The disciple has doubts about what the Guru has just told him. He voices his doubts through this question: Lord, be it because of delusion or even otherwise, that the Supreme Self or the Param Atma has come to consider itself as the Jeev or the individual soul, where the self is under self-imposed limitation, is because of superimposition, which delusion you say is beginningless. But what has no beginning can also have no end. Therefore, the Jeevhood of the soul also must have no end, and hence its transmigration must continue forever. That being the case, then how can there be liberation for the soul? O great Master, kindly enlighten me on this point. The teacher replied, You have indeed asked a very good question, O learned one. I will explain this to you. Listen attentively. The imagination that has been conjured up by delusion, that imagination can never be accepted as a fact, and it should never be accepted as a fact. Know that the self is unattached. It is beyond activity and it is formless. But for delusion, there can be no connection whatsoever of the self with the objective world, as in the case of blueness of the sky. The sky has no color of its own, but we mentally associate blueness with it. The blueness of the sky is in our mind. It is not in the sky. In the same way, limitation exists only in one's mind. It does not exist in the Absolute Self. It does not exist in the Param Atma. The Atma, which is the witness, which is beyond qualities and beyond activity, and which is realized within as knowledge and bliss absolute. The Jeevhood of that Atma has been superimposed by the delusion of the Buddhi, and it is not real. And because it is by nature an unreality, it ceases to exist when the delusion is gone. The Jeevhood exists only so long as the delusion lasts, since it is caused by indiscrimination due to an illusion. The rope is supposed to be a snake only so long as the mistake lasts, and there is no more snake when the illusion has vanished. Similar is the case here. Similarly, avidya or intense ignorance and its effects are also considered as beginningless. But with the rise of vidya or realization, the entire effects of avidya, even though beginningless, are destroyed together with their root avidya, just like dreams are destroyed on waking up from sleep. It is clear that the phenomenal universe, even though it is without beginning, is not eternal, just like previous non-existence, which though beginningless, yet ceases as soon as a thing comes into being, as soon as a thing comes into existence. Similarly, avidya, even though beginningless, disappears when realization comes. Previous non-existence, even though beginningless, is observed to have an end, So, the Jeevhood, which is imagined to be in the Atma, through its relation with superimposed attributes such as Buddhi, is not real, whereas the other, which is the Atma, is essentially different from it. The relation between the Atma and Buddhi is due to false knowledge. We see the Atma through the covering of Prakriti or nature, of which the Buddhi or intellect and the like are manifestations, and nature which is continuously changing. That nature leads us to think that the Atma which is behind it is also changing, which is a mistake. The stoppage of that superimposition takes place only and only through perfect knowledge. And what is perfect knowledge? Perfect knowledge, according to the Shrutis, consists in the realization of the identity of the individual soul and Brahm. It consists in realizing that the individual soul and Brahm are one. And how is this realization attained? This realization is attained by a perfect discrimination between the self and the non-self, by a perfect discrimination between the Atma and the non-Atma, between what is not the Atma. Therefore, one must strive for discrimination between the individual soul and the eternal soul. The water, which is very muddy, because there is so much mud in it, becomes clear, transparent water when the mud is removed from it. In the same way, when the taint of ignorance has been removed from the Atma, then the Atma also manifests its undimmed luster. When the unreal ceases to exist, this very individual soul is definitely realized as the eternal self, as the eternal Atma. Therefore, one must make it a point to completely remove things like egoism from the eternal self, things that are in reality superimpositions. This Vigyanmay Kosh, or this knowledge sheath that we have been talking about, this knowledge sheath also cannot be the Supreme Self or the Param Atma because of the following reasons. Firstly, the knowledge sheath is subject to change. It keeps on changing. Secondly, it is insentient. Thirdly, it is a limited thing. Fourthly, it is an object of the senses. And fifthly, it is not constantly present. An unreal thing cannot be taken for the real Atma, which is changeless, which is knowledge absolute, which is unlimited, which is the eternal subject, and which is the universal substratum of all things. Now we come to the Anandamay Kosh, or the blissful sheath. The blissful sheath is that modification of intense ignorance, of avidya, which manifests itself catching a reflection of the Atma, whose attributes are varying degrees of pleasure and the rest, and which appears in view, which is seen when an object that is agreeable to oneself presents itself. The blissful sheath is seen when we see and experience something that is to our liking. The blissful sheath itself makes itself spontaneously felt by those who are lucky during the fruition of their virtuous deeds. The blissful sheath makes itself spontaneously felt by those who are lucky enough to enjoy the fruits of their virtuous deeds, from which every being who has a form derives great joy without making any effort whatsoever. The blissful sheath is in full flow during deep sleep, while in the dreaming and wakeful states, it has only a partial, limited manifestation that is brought about by the sight of agreeable objects, and so on. The blissful sheath is also not the Supreme Self, because it is endowed with changeful attributes, because it is a modification of Prakriti, because it is the effect of past good deeds, and because it is embedded in the other sheaths, all of which themselves are modifications. When all the 5 sheaths have been eliminated by the reasoning on Shruti passages that describe the Atma by the process of elimination of Neti Neti, which means that the Atma is not this, with reference to objects to see whether they are the Atma or not, then what remains at the end of this process, as the culminating point of the process, beyond which the process of reasoning or analysis cannot go any further, that is the Atma, that is the witness, that is the knowledge absolute. The effulgent Atma, which is distinct from the 5 sheaths, is the witness of the 3 states. It is the real, it is the changeless, it is the untainted. Ignorance does not taint it. It is the everlasting bliss. This effulgent Atma is to be realized, is to be attained by the wise man as his own self, as his own Atma. The disciple again has a question. He asks, O Master, after these 5 sheaths have been eliminated as unreal, I find nothing in this universe but a void, where there is the absence of everything. What entity is there left now with which the wise knower of the self should realize his identity? The Guru answered, O learned man, you have again asked a very good and pertinent question. You are indeed clever in discrimination. That by which all these modifications, such as egoism, as well as their subsequent absence during deep sleep, are perceived, but which itself is not perceived, you should know that Atma, the knower, through the sharpest intellect. That which is perceived by something else, that has for its witness the latter, that has for its witness something else that perceives it. When there is no agent to perceive a thing, we cannot speak of it as being perceived at all. This Atma is a self-cognized entity because it is cognized by itself. Therefore, the individual soul is itself and directly the supreme Brahm and nothing else. That which clearly manifests itself in the 3 states of wakefulness, of dream, and of profound sleep, that which is inwardly perceived in the mind in various forms as an unbroken series of egoistic impressions, that which witnesses the egoism, the buddhi and the like, which are of diverse forms and modifications, and that which makes itself felt as existence, knowledge, and bliss absolute. Know this Atma, your own self, your own Atma within your heart. When a fool sees the reflection of the sun mirrored in the water of the jar, the fool thinks it is the sun itself. Similarly, the stupid person, through delusion, identifies himself with the reflection of the Chit, of the Atma, which is knowledge absolute, that is caught in the Buddhi, which is its superimposition. The wise man, on the other hand, leaves aside the jar, he leaves aside the water, and he leaves aside the reflection of the sun in it, and instead he sees the self-luminous sun which illumines these three and is independent of them. He sees that sun directly. In the same way, discarding the body, discarding the buddhi, and discarding the reflection of the chit or the atma in it, and realizing the witness, the self, the knowledge absolute, the cause of the manifestation of everything, which is hidden in the depths of the buddhi, which is distinct from the gross and the subtle, which is eternal, which is omnipresent, which is all pervading, and which is extremely subtle, and which has neither exterior nor interior, and which is identical with oneself. And fully realizing this true nature of oneself, one must become free, one becomes free from sin, one becomes free from taint, one becomes free from death, one becomes free from grief, and one becomes the embodiment of bliss. Being illumined by himself, being illumined himself, he is afraid of no one. For a seeker after liberation, there is no other way to the breaking of the bonds of transmigration than the realization of the truth of one's own self, than the realization of the truth of one's own Atma. The realization of one's identity with Brahm, this is the cause of liberation from the bonds of sansar, by means of which the wise man attains Brahm, the one without a second, the bliss absolute. Yes, the realization of one's identity with Brahm is the cause of liberation from the bonds of sansar, by means of which the wise man attains Brahm, the one without a second, the bliss absolute. This concludes part 8 of Vivek Chudamani. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om.